March 5th, 1974. Coconut Grove, Florida. 17-year-old Amy Billig phones her father from her home and arranges to meet him at his workplace in order to borrow money to have lunch with friends. Amy is last seen hitchhiking on a highway, but never shows up to meet her father or her friends, and is subsequently reported missing. After being informed that Amy was abducted by a gang of bikers, Amy's mother spends the next several years attempting to track her down without success. The Billig family also endures 2 decades worth of harassing phone calls from a man who claims to have kidnapped Amy, but even after the caller is identified and arrested, no trace of Amy is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a very memorable missing persons case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1974 disappearance of Amy Billig. Ever since the inception of this podcast, I've received numerous requests to cover this case, a very convoluted saga which wound up lasting over 2 decades. It involves a 17-year-old girl from Florida who vanished without explanation while on her way to meet her father, and her family soon received a tip that Amy had been abducted by a notorious biker gang who was in the area at that time. One of the most remarkable aspects of this story is Amy's mother, Susan Billig, who may be the most relentless parent of a missing person I have ever seen. Over the next several years, Susan chased down every possible lead, even though it involved interacting with some dangerous characters and potentially putting her own life at risk. There were many occasions in which it seemed like Susan was only a step or two away from finding her daughter, but just could not uncover conclusive evidence that Amy was still alive. It's also possible that the whole biker angle was nothing more than a wild goose chase, as it turned out another individual spent the better part of 20 years tormenting the Billig family with phone calls in which he claimed to be responsible for Amy's disappearance. In the end, we still don't know what actually happened to Amy, so we're going to explore all the different angles of this story on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved disappearance of Amy Billig. Our story begins in 1974 in Coconut Grove, Florida, the oldest neighborhood in Miami. Our central figure is Amy Billig, a 17-year-old senior at the Adelphi Academy of Coral Gables who is only 3 weeks away from graduation. Amy currently lives with her mother and father, Susan and Ned Billig, as well as her 16-year-old brother, Josh. The Billigs originally hail from Oyster Bay, New York, before they moved to Florida 6 years earlier, and Ned currently owns a local art gallery. Susan, who usually goes by the name Sue, had a very difficult time having children, as she had to endure 5 miscarriages over the course of 10 years before she finally gave birth to her daughter. Amy has been described as a quote-unquote flower child whose passions include reading and writing poetry, singing, and playing the flute and guitar, and she hopes to become an actress someday. At around noon on March the 5th, Amy returned home from school for lunch, and phoned her father at his art gallery to ask if she could borrow $2 since she was planning to go downtown to meet two of her friends for lunch. Ned said yes, and asked Amy to meet him at the art gallery, which was less than a mile away, in order to pick up the money. Amy would last be seen by construction workers holding her thumb out at the corner of Main Highway and Poinciana Street. This implied that Amy was planning to hitchhike, which she often did since it was a much more common practice back then. However, Amy would not arrive at the art gallery or meet her friends for lunch. When she failed to return home for dinner, her family contacted the police and reported her missing. Once Amy's disappearance generated publicity, numerous eyewitnesses would come forward who claimed to have seen her, but their accounts often contradicted one another, as Amy was seen by various witnesses climbing into various vehicles such as a light-colored pickup truck, a light-colored Jeep, and a beige van. 11 days after Amy originally went missing, the Billig family received a phone call from a woman calling herself Susan Johnson. She said this wasn't her real name because she was in fear for her life, but Johnson claimed that Amy had been abducted by a renegade motorcycle gang known as the Outlaws while she was hitchhiking, and that a friend of hers had seen Amy with the gang in Daytona Beach, which had recently held their annual Bike Week event. Since it turned out the Outlaws had passed through Coconut Grove on the day Amy went missing, this seemed like a promising lead. However, before this lead could be pursued any further, another unexpected development occurred. On March the 18th, a hitchhiker found an Instamatic camera in the grass next to the southbound lane of Florida's Turnpike, approximately 250 miles north of Miami. The camera was in close proximity to an off-ramp exit which led to the town of Wildwood, and it had a piece of adhesive tape with Amy Billig's name on it. Since the Billig family were unable to recall the last time they had seen this camera, it could not be conclusively determined if Amy had it with her at the time she disappeared, or if it might have been lost or stolen on a previous occasion. There was a roll of film in the camera containing 4 undeveloped photographs, but 3 of them were too overexposed to be of any use. The 4th photo featured a vine-covered wall with a white pickup truck parked in the background, but no one recognized the truck or could figure out if the photo had any significance to Amy's disappearance. The next major development took place on March the 21st, when the Billigs received a phone call from someone who claimed to have kidnapped Amy and was demanding a $30,000 ransom for her return. During one of the calls, Sue could even hear the muffled sounds of someone saying, "Mama, Mama, please," in the background. Sue was eventually provided with instructions for a ransom drop in the lobby of a Miami Beach hotel, and when she showed up with the money, Sue was surprised to encounter a teenage boy. But it turned out the Billigs had notified the police about the ransom call, so they were staking out the lobby and quickly made an arrest. It turned out the callers were a pair of 16-year-old twin brothers named Charles and Larry Glasser, and while they were charged with extortion, investigators concluded that they had no actual involvement in Amy's disappearance. Around this same time, the Billigs also started receiving harassing calls from a man calling himself Hal Johnson, who claimed that he had abducted Amy and was training her as a sex slave. This man would continuously torment the Billigs with harassing phone calls at all hours of the night, in which he described horrible things that were happening to Amy, but we'll talk more about him in a little while. Anyway, by the end of March, Amy's high school graduation took place, but since she was still missing, the school decided to graduate her in absentia. Well, since there was still no trace of Amy, the Billigs wanted to explore the tip they received about her being abducted by a biker gang. They wound up speaking to a bail bondsman who had worked with the Outlaws, and he arranged for 2 bikers from the gang to visit the Billig home for a meeting. When they arrived, Sue and Ned asked if they knew anything about Amy's disappearance and showed them a photograph of her. They both claimed to have not seen Amy personally, but confirmed that it was not uncommon for biker gangs to kidnap and sell young women, whom they usually referred to as quote-unquote old ladies. They would often ensure that the victims were hooked on drugs, which would keep them trapped in that lifestyle, and the bikers had such little regard for these women as human beings that they would be treated as property and traded for such items as a motorcycle or a credit card. The 2 outlaw members took Amy's photo and promised to ask around about her, but they were unable to turn up any information. During their final phone call with Sue, they advised her to, quote-unquote, forget the whole thing. However, Sue did not want to ignore this lead and decided to perform her own independent investigation. 3 months after Amy originally went missing, Sue received word that the outlaws were in Orlando and had been staying in a clubhouse outside the nearby town of Kissimmee before they left the area. Sue visited the empty clubhouse and found a hairbrush containing a female hair, which was later determined to be consistent with Amy's hair. She showed Amy's photograph to a number of local residents who believed they had seen her with the outlaws. The most promising identification came from a convenience store manager who recognized Amy's photo and said that she often saw her frequent the store accompanied by bikers and that she always bought vegetarian soup. Since Amy was a strict vegetarian, this convinced Sue that the manager had seen Amy and that she was still alive and being held against her will. But unfortunately, all of Sue's attempts to track down her daughter were unsuccessful. The search for Amy crippled the Billigs financially and caused Ned to develop a drinking problem and sink into a deep depression. He eventually wound up losing his art gallery, and the family was forced to move into a smaller house. In November of 1975, Sue received a phone call from a man who claimed to be a member of another motorcycle gang called the Pagans. He said he had recently gotten out of jail and seen a photo in a newspaper which showed Sue holding up a sign with Amy's picture on it. Not only did he recognize Amy, but he had actually owned her for a time and referred to her as his quote-unquote old lady. He agreed to a meeting at a remote gas station in which he promised to reveal more information. Well, Sue and Ned went to this location and were soon met by a large biker. It turned out his name was Paul Branch, and he had an extensive criminal record, which included an 8-year prison sentence for murder. Branch told the Billigs he would only share the full story about Amy with Sue if she would accompany him to his trailer alone. Naturally, Ned did not want his wife going off with Branch, but Sue told him it was okay and climbed onto Branch's bike. He then took Sue to his trailer, and after they arrived, she showed him a photograph of Amy. Branch confirmed that he knew her and that she went by the nickname Mute since she was so quiet and appeared to be afraid of everyone. According to Branch, he had met Mute at a biker party in Orlando. She looked so beaten and drugged out that she could not even remember who she was or where she was most of the time, so Branch offered to buy her, and they lived together for a few months. One day in July of 1974, after leaving Mute with a friend of his for safekeeping, Branch wound up getting arrested, and by the time he was released from jail, Mute and his friend were gone, and he hadn't seen her since. When Sue asked Branch to provide proof to back up his story, he mentioned a 2-inch appendectomy scar Mute had near her waist. Since Amy had such a scar, and Sue had never divulged this detail to either the police or the media, this convinced her that Branch was telling the truth. Branch said he would attempt to contact another biker to try and find out where Amy was and get back to Sue when he had more information. Several months passed by, but in June of 1976, Branch contacted Sue and told her that Amy was in Tulsa, Oklahoma with another motorcycle gang known as the Rogues. He asked Sue to meet him there and would make arrangements for her to see her daughter. Well, Sue traveled to Tulsa, but she was forced to wait in a motel for weeks before Branch finally showed up. Now, there are different accounts of what happened next. In a book which was published about this case titled Without a Trace, The Disappearance of Amy Billig, the story goes that after he arrived in Tulsa, Branch told Sue that he was going to search for Amy and let her know when he found her. But he never contacted Sue, and since her expenses from staying in Tulsa had completely depleted her funds, she decided to fly back home. However, according to the Unsolved Mystery segment, Branch actually took Sue to a local tavern filled with bikers and promised that Amy would be delivered to her there. But when Branch went over to speak with some other bikers, the situation escalated into a brawl. A biker then grabbed Sue and took her outside, where she was placed into a waiting cab and driven away from the scene. I'm not sure which version is true, but whatever the case, the next time Sue heard anything about Branch, she was told that both of his kneecaps were broken, so he never contacted her again. However, Branch did later send Sue a message through her attorney that he had heard Amy was now in Seattle, Washington. By 1977, the stress of the whole situation caused Sue to suffer a mild heart attack, which required a bypass operation. But this was not going to slow her down on her quest to find Amy, so only 2 months after the operation, Sue traveled to Seattle to resume her search. She frequented a number of local bars, tattoo parlors, and motorcycle shops, and showed Amy's photograph to many different people. Some of them recognized her, and confirmed Branch's story that she was a very quiet woman who went by the nickname Mute. But in spite of this, Sue could still not locate Amy. There would be a number of seemingly promising leads which went nowhere. In 1979, Susan received a phone call from an anonymous male who claimed that Amy was at a remote truck stop outside of Reno, Nevada, and that she was beaten and drugged up and in desperate need for help. The FBI investigated the tip and learned that a biker gang had recently been at the truck stop, but were unable to verify if Amy was with them. In August of 1980, the Billigs received a call from a man who claimed he was married to Amy and taking good care of her. The number was traced to a young man named Joel Bolin, who lived in the town of Cement, Oklahoma, but Bolin denied making the call and claimed to have never heard of Amy Billig. Since Bolin often had people at his house for parties, he believed that someone else may have secretly made the call from his phone. In 1992, the Billigs received another unexpected lead when they were contacted by a private investigator named Virginia Snyder. Snyder claimed that a British private investigator she had been working with on an unrelated case had been approached by an American biker inside a post office in Falmouth, England. The biker asked the investigator if he was interested in buying a girl, and when the investigator asked for more details, he was told the girl was an American from Oyster Bay, which happened to be Amy's birthplace. The biker also said her name was Mute, but when the investigator kept asking questions, the biker walked away. Shortly thereafter, the investigator passed away, and this lead never went anywhere. It was around the same time period when Sue was diagnosed with lung cancer and informed that she likely only had 4 months to live, but she managed to make a full recovery following an operation. But shortly thereafter, her husband Ned would soon be diagnosed with lung cancer, and unfortunately, his cancer was inoperable. While he was on his deathbed, Ned told Sue, quote, "I want to see Amy before I die," but he would pass away on March the 1st, 1993, at the age of 69. 10 months later, Amy's story would be featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but the biggest development in the case would occur the following year. Remember how I said that a man named Hal Johnson called the Billig family a few weeks after Amy went missing and told them he was trading her as a sex slave? Well, believe it or not, this same man would continue to make harassing phone calls to the Billigs for the next 20 years. He seemed to alternate between claiming that he was holding Amy captive himself or that she had been sold as a sex slave to places like Saudi Arabia. He said some pretty horrible things, most of which I prefer not to repeat here, but as an example, he once told Sue that he was going to abduct her and sell her into sex slavery just like Amy because his clients wanted, quote-unquote, mother-daughter teams. Sometimes, he would call the Billigs 6 or 7 times per night, and then go months without calling them at all, but it seemed like whenever Amy's case made the news, the calls would start up again. On multiple occasions, he even made arrangements to meet up with Sue, and she always went to the locations he specified, but he never showed up. Throughout it all, the caller never seemed to provide any exclusive details about Amy or her disappearance, which were not already public knowledge, but in spite of the non-stop harassment, the Billigs refused to change their phone number on the off chance that he might reveal some crucial information at some point. When Ned was dying of cancer, he said to Sue, quote, "I can't leave you. You'll be alone when that man calls." Sure enough, after Ned's funeral, Sue returned home to a threatening phone call from Hal Johnson, who stated, quote, "Ned's dead, isn't he? You're alone now, aren't you? You'd better watch out." End quote. For years, police did attempt to trace Hal Johnson's phone calls, but it turned out they always came from public payphones. If a stakeout was ever set up for one of the payphones he used, he would always just move on to another one for his next series of calls. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Johnson started using a cell phone, which was initially considered to be untraceable, But by October of 1995, a new state-of-the-art cell phone tracer was developed, which wound up matching the phone to an import company, which was being used by a branch of the United States Customs Department. When police played a recording of one of the phone calls to a customs supervisor, Hal Johnson was finally identified as 48-year-old Henry Johnson Blair, who would be arrested and charged with 3 counts of aggravated stalking. Blair was a 24-year veteran with the Customs Department who had worked as a special agent in a unit which made drug seizures, and he was now a group supervisor of an anti-smuggling unit. 1 year before his arrest, Blair had even been awarded the Order of Isabella the Catholic, Spain's highest civilian honor, by King Juan Carlos for helping recover a stolen 17th century painting. Blair was also married and had 2 daughters, so his arrest came as a complete surprise to everyone who knew him. When Blair was questioned, he denied having any involvement in Amy's disappearance and claimed to have never even met her. He said he was an alcoholic who suffered from depression and that the stress of his job had given him an obsessive-compulsive disorder which compelled him to relentlessly phone and torment Sue Billig for over 20 years. Following Blair's arrest, a reporter who was searching through Amy's diary discovered an entry written 6 weeks before she vanished, which suddenly took on a greater significance. It read, quote, "Hank says as soon as I finish school, he wants me to go to South America with him. I told him he's crazy." End quote. Well, none of Amy's family or friends could recall her ever knowing anyone named Hank, and Hank just happened to be the name that Henry Johnson Blair went by. At the time Amy went missing, Blair was living in Florida, and one of his duties with the Customs Department involved working as an undercover sky marshal, which often required him to take trips to South America. And remember how when Amy's camera was found, it contained an undeveloped photograph featuring a white pickup truck? Well, during the mid-1970s, Blair often drove around in vehicles which had been seized by customs, and one of them was a white pickup truck. He also sometimes drove around in a beige van, and there had been unconfirmed sightings of Amy climbing into both a beige van and a white pickup truck on the day she went missing. Unfortunately, by this point, the photo of the pickup truck from Amy's camera was no longer available, as it had been destroyed when a police property room was cleaned out years earlier. But in spite of these revelations, investigators were unable to find any evidence which linked Blair to Amy's disappearance, and he possibly had an alibi. On February the 22nd, 1974, Blair and his wife got married and left on their honeymoon to San Francisco, but police were unable to conclusively determine if the couple returned to Florida 10 days or 13 days later. If it was 13 days, then Blair would have been outside the state on March 5th, the day Amy went missing. Anyway, months after his arrest, Blair went on trial and was convicted on 2 counts of misdemeanor stalking, for which he received a 2-year prison sentence. Sue then proceeded to file a civil lawsuit against Blair, and they ultimately reached a settlement for $5 million. Following his release from prison, Blair died in 2006. But this would still not be the end of the story. Blair's arrest reinvigorated the investigation into Amy's disappearance and prompted the lead detective to track down Paul Branch and interview him in October of 1996. By this point, Branch was living in a trailer in rural Virginia with his girlfriend and dying of cancer. The interview with Branch failed to generate any new information, and he would pass away 2 months later on New Year's Eve. However, shortly thereafter, Sue Billig was contacted by the producers of a British documentary which was being made about Amy's case. They told her that they had spoken with Paul Branch's girlfriend, who had allegedly heard a shocking deathbed confession from him before he passed away. The girlfriend's real name has never been revealed publicly, but the book Without a Trace referred to her as Tootsie, so that's what I'll call her here. The producers wanted to arrange a meeting between Sue and Tootsie and film them when Tootsie revealed what Branch said in his confession. Well, the meeting went through as planned, and Tootsie told Sue that Amy had been killed on the same day she disappeared. According to Tootsie, Branch had been attending a party being held by the Pagans motorcycle gang at their clubhouse when Amy showed up with a girlfriend of hers. Amy apparently got so drunk and high on drugs that she started mouthing off to one of the bikers, which led to her being gang raped by about 24 people. When Amy attempted to fight back, they injected her with more drugs to subdue her, but she wound up overdosing, so they disposed of her body by tossing her into the swamps of the Florida Everglades. Well, needless to say, there was a lot of skepticism that this alleged confession from Branch ever took place, especially when Tootsie revealed that she had been paid by the producers of the documentary to share her story. In 2001, Sue teamed up with writer Greg Anapu to share the entire saga of Amy's story in the aforementioned book, Without a Trace, The Disappearance of Amy Billig. During his research, Anapu managed to track down and interview a biker named Pompano Red, who had been Paul Branch's best friend and roommate in 1974. Pompano Red actually confirmed that Amy was Branch's quote-unquote old lady, and that she was so drugged up most of the time that she barely spoke. Red also claimed that he drove her from Florida to Arlington, Virginia after Branch went to jail, but after selling her to another biker who was supposedly traveling to New Jersey, Red never saw her again. If Red's story was true, then this would have completely debunked the story about Amy being killed on the same day she went missing. Sadly, the release of the book would still not lead to any conclusive answers about what happened. On June 7, 2005, after relentlessly pursuing her daughter for 3 decades, Susan Billig finally passed away at the age of 80 due to complications from a heart attack. So after 45 years, the exact circumstances of what actually happened to Amy Billig remain unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Wow, this case is a major heartbreaker. Before we discuss what happened to Amy, we have to take a few moments to talk about the incredible strength of her mother, Susan Billig. I've done a number of episodes about missing or murdered people whose families were amazing advocates for them and went to incredible lengths to seek justice and keep the case in the spotlight. But Susan Billig is pretty much in a class by herself. No parent should ever have to go through what she went through, as her daughter's disappearance was pretty much a non-stop ordeal which ruined the last 30 years of her life. This entire tragedy is compounded by the fact that Sue had to experience 5 miscarriages before she had Amy, only for her daughter to go missing right before she hit adulthood. Sue always said that her biggest regret about her relentless pursuit of Amy is that it prevented her from spending more time with her son, Josh. He tried to assure his mother that it wasn't a problem, but it's clear that Amy's disappearance took an enormous toll on Josh as well, as he wound up dropping out of high school. Thankfully, he did find a successful career working as a stonemason, and eventually got married and had 2 daughters of his own. And of course, the loss of Amy crippled the Billig family financially and caused her father, Ned, to lose his art gallery and develop a drinking problem. If you read Without a Trace, it is astonishing how many hoaxsters and wild goose chases the Billigs had to deal with, and I couldn't even cover all of them on this podcast. I already mentioned the teenage twins who tried to extort $30,000 from the family with a phony ransom demand, but just to provide another example, there were 2 former narcotics agents who approached Sue and said they would perform a search for Amy for $3,000. Sue then gave them a $1,500 down payment, which was all she could afford at that point, and then they proceeded to do absolutely nothing. But no matter how unbelievable the lead may have been, Sue made sure to pursue every single one of them if there was even a glimmer of hope that she would find her daughter. And there were so many occasions where she believed that she was only 1 or 2 steps away from finally seeing Amy, but it would never pan out. What's most remarkable is that Sue's searches often required her to put her own life at risk by interacting with bikers and other shady characters. This was a completely different world to her, as the Billigs were a rather artsy, middle-class family who lived in a nice suburban neighborhood. When Sue first met Paul Branch, and he demanded that she accompany him to his trailer alone, she acknowledged that she didn't know if she would ever see her husband or son again, but she just could not pass up a potential opportunity to find out what happened to Amy. Sue believed that one of the reasons she was able to survive situations like this was because even though many of the people she met were unsavory characters, they still had mothers and could empathize with the plight of a mother trying to find her child. During her Unsolved Mysteries interview, Sue stated that when Branch told her that he had bought and owned her daughter, she wanted to kill him and tear him apart, but she knew she had to hold back and relate to him on a one-on-one personal level if there was any chance of getting Amy back. And of course, the Billig family also had to deal with the torment of harassing phone calls from Henry Johnson Blair for 20 straight years, but we'll talk more about that in a little while. When you consider the physical and mental toll this whole ordeal took on Sue, which included lung cancer and multiple heart attacks, it's nothing short of a miracle that she managed to live until the age of 80. But the fact that she was only given 4 months to live in 1992 and managed to hold on for another 13 years just demonstrates her strength. Anyway, the closest Sue ever came to a resolution was the second-hand account of an alleged deathbed confession which described Amy being killed in the most horrific fashion imaginable, but there's a lot of skepticism about the credibility of that story. And that's ultimately the most frustrating thing about this case. There have been so many different leads in relation to Amy's disappearance over the past 45 years, but for all we know, all of them may be red herrings, and Amy could very well have been the victim of someone who has never even popped up on the radar. However, let's start at the very beginning. The last time Amy was seen, she was supposedly hitchhiking, which I'm sure raised some eyebrows, but you have to remember that hitchhiking was just a much more common practice during the 1970s. Amy apparently did it quite often because she lived in a relatively safe area, and since the route from her home to her father's art gallery was less than a mile, I'm sure she had no inkling that anything bad could happen. It's because of cases like this that the general public became more aware of how dangerous hitchhiking can be. In Without a Trace, there's actually a story about Sue and Ned picking up a young female hitchhiker shortly after Amy's disappearance, which prompted Sue to tell her, quote, "Haven't you seen my daughter's missing posters all over town?" Sue would cross paths with the same young woman years later, who told Sue that learning about Amy's case convinced her of the dangers of hitchhiking and probably saved her life. Now, the first major clue in this case was the discovery of Amy's camera on Florida's Turnpike, which definitely belonged to Amy since it had her name on it. If Amy was abducted, then the most logical explanation is that her kidnapper tossed it outside their vehicle, or Amy herself may have done it, in order to leave behind a clue that she was in danger. But the problem is that since Amy was alone when she returned home from school on the day she went missing, no one can be 100% certain if she had the camera with her when she left. The Billigs even acknowledged that they could not remember the last time they saw the camera, so for all they knew, Amy could have lost it or had it stolen on a previous occasion. Now, this location was approximately 250 miles north of Coconut Grove, and we know that the outlaw biker gang were allegedly in Coconut Grove on the day Amy went missing, before they traveled north to Daytona Beach for Bike Week. The spot where the camera was discovered would have been on their route to Daytona Beach, but the problem is that it was found next to the southbound lane. However, there would later be reported sightings of Amy with the outlaws in Kissimmee, which is south of Daytona Beach, so theoretically, they could have tossed the camera while traveling there. This whole angle with the bikers started when the Billigs received a phone call from a woman calling herself Susan Johnson, who claimed that Amy had been seen with the outlaws in Daytona Beach. Sadly, it is true that biker gangs did abduct and sell young girls during this time period. The Unsolved Mysteries segment about this case features an interview with a woman named Gina Andrew, who said she was kidnapped by a biker gang when she was just 12 years old and had already been sold 4 times before she turned 13. Gina was even traded for such items as a motorcycle and a pair of leather chaps, but after being passed around for 5 years, she finally managed to escape. So I'm sure that if Gina was able to survive an ordeal like that for 5 years, this gave the Billigs hope that Amy could as well. But the problem is that it doesn't sound like Susan Johnson actually saw Amy herself. She only heard this information from a friend of hers who had seen Amy with the outlaws. So essentially, this entire angle began because of a second-hand account from someone who heard an eyewitness account from someone else. The part of this story which has never been made clear is how Susan Johnson's friend would have recognized Amy to begin with. I know that Sue Billig showed Amy's photograph to a number of people who were certain they had seen her with bikers, but the problem is that Amy pretty much fits the profile of what you'd picture a 1970s teenage hippie girl to look like. So I'm sure that a lot of teenage girls from that time period resembled Amy, and those witnesses could have easily mistaken someone else for her. I know Sue put a lot of credence into the sighting of Amy in the convenience store in Kissimmee because this girl always bought vegetarian soup, but I hardly think that Amy was the only vegetarian teenage girl during this time period. Of course, the biker theory gained more credence when Paul Branch came forward and claimed that he had owned Amy for a time, and Sue found him to be credible after he mentioned Amy's appendectomy scar, a detail which Sue had never revealed publicly. Now, it's one thing to torment the mother of a missing girl when you're doing it anonymously over the phone, but Branch flat out told Sue to her face that he had once bought and owned her daughter like she was a piece of property. Like I mentioned earlier, Sue said she wanted to kill Branch when he told her this. If Branch was lying and he never even met Amy, what motive would he have for making this story up? Well, the other hoaxsters who provided false information about Amy did so because they wanted to profit financially, but in Branch's case, he offered to help Sue find Amy without asking for any money up front. All that being said, he still benefited financially as he made Sue pay for his travel expenses and repairs for his motorcycle while he searched for Amy. When Branch showed up to meet Sue in Tulsa after standing her up for weeks, he stayed in an expensive honeymoon suite at a hotel on Sue's dime, even though she could not afford it. And at the time, Branch was also facing legal problems for a weapons charge and a DUI, but a lawyer friend of Sue's agreed to represent him for free and got him off. In the end, Branch did reap some rewards for offering to assist Sue, even though he provided her with nothing in return, so this whole episode may have been nothing more than a long con on his part. But on one occasion, Branch did tell Sue that if he wanted to extort money from her, he would have asked for a lot more. I previously mentioned a section from the Unsolved Mysteries segment where Branch dragged Sue to a tavern in Tulsa where he promised to reunite her with Amy until a brawl broke out. While there's no mention of this incident in Without a Trace, the way the reenactment is presented on Unsolved Mysteries, it comes across as if the entire fight was a staged incident, since Sue was dragged outside by one of the bikers into the parking lot, where a taxi was already conveniently waiting for her. I know Sue later received word that Branch's kneecaps were broken in this incident, but since she never actually saw him again, I'm not sure we can be 100% certain that these injuries actually occurred. Throughout all this, the only proof Branch provided to suggest that he really did know Amy was his mention of the appendectomy scar, but for all we know, that could have been nothing more than a lucky guess. Now, following the episode with Branch, the one other lead which potentially involved Amy being held captive by bikers was the story from the British private investigator who claimed that a biker approached him in 1992 and offered to sell him a girl who matched Amy's description. The biker apparently said that she was originally from Oyster Bay, Amy's original birthplace, and called her Mute, which is the nickname Branch said Amy was known by. Well, as compelling as this lead may have sounded, Amy would have been 35 years old in 1992 and been traded around by bikers for 18 years, and I just don't know if someone in her position could have survived that lifestyle for that long. Even if you disregard that, there are still a lot of issues with this story. I will say that Virginia Snyder, the private investigator who originally approached Sue with this lead, does have a lot of credibility. Snyder was a former investigative journalist who garnered some recognition when she became the first female private investigator in the history of Florida. She was also featured in an Unsolved Mysteries Final Appeal segment about the Bird Road rapist, where a man named Luis Diaz was convicted of the rapes of several women, but Snyder was convinced of his innocence and worked as an investigator for the defense, and Diaz was eventually exonerated via DNA testing. So I do not believe that Snyder made up this story about the biker in England, and was only passing on what the British investigator told her. I do think it's a stretch that a biker gang would have been able to take a captive woman overseas to England, but the part I really don't believe is that they would try to sell her in a post office. The reenactment of this scene on Unsolved Mysteries is unintentionally hilarious, as the actor they cast to play the investigator is this proper middle-aged British gentleman who seems like an unlikely customer for sex trafficking. They actually show a biker approaching this guy in a busy post office in broad daylight where he says, quote, "Hey Pops, you look like you could use a little companionship." Yeah, it's pretty laughable. I guess the investigator could have learned details about Amy's case and decided to make up this story in hopes of extorting money from Sue, but since he passed away shortly thereafter, we'll probably never learn the truth. But I'm pretty confident that Amy was not in England in 1992. And now we have to talk about the alleged deathbed confession that Paul Branch gave to his girlfriend before he succumbed to cancer. His story was that Amy wound up at a party at the Pagans Clubhouse where she was subsequently gang raped and succumbed to a drug overdose before her body was dumped in the swamp. If you watch the Unsolved Mysteries segment on Amazon Prime, they have a brief text update at the end which mentions the so-called confession, and it kind of bothers me that they treat it as if it's a resolution to this case. A lot of people do not find the confession to be credible, and there is no evidence to substantiate it. Of course, the fact that Branch's girlfriend only shared the story after being paid by a documentary crew has led to serious questions about her credibility. She even later admitted that even though Branch did tell her what happened to Amy, it technically wasn't a deathbed confession. The way she told it, Amy and some girlfriend of hers showed up at the party, and there's no indication that Amy was abducted. Since Amy had already made arrangements to meet her father and friends of hers, it sounds like it would have been very out of character for her to just run off like that on her own, and it's unclear how she would have wound up at some biker party. And who exactly would this girlfriend have been who showed up alongside Amy? I also have issues with the claims that Amy was gang raped by upwards of 24 bikers, but since she fought back, they gave her more drugs to subdue her, which caused her to overdose. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that if Amy was being attacked by that many bikers at once, they would not need drugs to prevent her from fighting back. If Amy was killed on the same day she disappeared, and Branch was present when it happened, why would he have contacted Sue? I mean, obviously, Paul Branch was a bad guy, but leading Amy's mother on a wild goose chase like that when you know she's already dead is a special kind of sadistic. Yes, I do believe Branch took advantage of Sue, but I think that if he was 100% certain that Amy was dead, he would have just asked her to pay him money up front and taken off. One of the main reasons people are skeptical that this incident at the party took place is because a lot of people would have been there, and as far as anyone knows, no one else has ever spoken about it. Now, Greg Anapu, the author of Without a Trace, he shares his own personal thoughts near the end of the book, and while he believes the confession never happened, he actually does not discount the idea that Branch really did have Amy at some point. This mainly stems from the fact that Anapu was able to track down Branch's old roommate, Pompano Red, who corroborated Branch's story that Amy had been with him for a time before Red drove Amy to Virginia while Branch was in jail and sold her to another biker. Unlike most of the other eyewitnesses in this case, who claimed they had seen Amy after recognizing her photo, Red was one of the only people who actually interacted with her. By the time he shared this story with Anapu, Red had been ravaged by cancer and not spoken with Branch for years, so what did he really have to gain by admitting to transporting a kidnapped girl across state lines? For this reason, Anapu theorizes that Branch may have actually been the one who abducted Amy on the day she went missing, but fudged certain details of his story to avoid admitting this to Sue. But before we jump to that conclusion, we have to discuss Henry Johnson Blair and his 20-plus years of harassing phone calls. Even though Blair was not identified until over a year after the Unsolved Mysteries segment originally aired, I'm actually surprised they never made any mention of the series of calls from the mysterious Hal Johnson, which, considering how close it was to his real name, has to be the lamest pseudonym ever. When Blair was arrested, the authorities said it was not uncommon for people to harass and torment the families of victims in missing persons cases, but it was unprecedented for the same person to do so for such a prolonged period of time. You might recall the episode I did about L'Enfant, the story of a man who was tormented by non-stop threatening phone calls for 9 years, but Blair managed to go twice as long as that. I mean, obviously, Blair is a very sick and twisted person who really seemed to get off on this, but it's hard to imagine why he would keep it up for 2 decades unless he had some sort of personal investment in this case. The whole thing is even more baffling when you consider that Blair was a customs department official who was apparently well regarded at his job and kept up the facade of being an ordinary family man. Believe it or not, when Blair went on trial, he had the absolute nerve to assign partial blame to Susan Billig for enabling him because she never hung up the phone whenever he called her. Yeah, that's pretty much like putting up the defense that a rape victim was asking for it. The only reason Sue endured Blair's abuse was because she hoped he might reveal important information about what happened to her daughter, so of course she wasn't going to hang up the phone. This is the reason many families of missing people never change their phone number. When Blair testified, Sue was not actually allowed to be present in the courtroom, but once she found out that Blair had tried to blame her for enabling him, she decided to hit him with a civil suit, and good for her. But while it's indisputable that Henry Johnson Blair is a massive douchebag, it's unclear if he had any actual involvement in Amy's disappearance. During all of his phone calls, Blair never revealed any exclusive information to suggest he really did abduct Amy, but there are 2 compelling things which connect him to her. When Amy's camera was found, it contained an undeveloped photograph of a white pickup truck, and Blair apparently drove a truck like that during that time period. Of course, since I'm sure a lot of people drove white pickup trucks in 1974, this doesn't prove anything, though it is a shame that the photo was destroyed long before Blair was arrested, so we can't study it today. But the photo was described as featuring a vine-covered wall with the pickup truck parked in the background. This makes it sound like the vine-covered wall was the reason Amy took the photo to begin with, and the truck just happened to be in the frame. If that's the case, then it's likely that the white pickup truck has no significance, and it's just a coincidence that Blair also happened to drive one at that time. But the entry from Amy's diary mentioning a man named Hank is a much more compelling connection. As you recall, 6 weeks before she went missing, Amy wrote that this Hank wanted her to run away to South America with him, and Blair often traveled to South America while working as a sky marshal. I know that none of Amy's friends and family could recall her ever knowing anyone named Hank, but keep in mind that they did not notice Amy's diary entry until after Blair was arrested. By that point, over 20 years had passed, so it's possible that there was a guy named Hank whom everyone had forgotten about. But let's suppose she was referring to Henry Johnson Blair. He would have been 26 years old in March of 1974, so if Amy had begun a relationship with an older man, I could see her not telling anyone about it, which is why they never knew about this mysterious Hank. But the way Amy phrased the entry in her diary implies that Hank was interested in her, but that doesn't necessarily mean she had the same interest in him, as she specifically wrote, quote, "I told him he's crazy." So theoretically, if Blair crossed paths with Amy on the day she disappeared, she could have resisted his advances or turned down his request to go to South America with him. If Blair did not take this rejection well, things may have escalated into violence and Amy wound up dead. The biggest uncertainty is whether or not Blair had an alibi on March the 5th, 1974. He got married and left on a honeymoon to San Francisco on February the 22nd and returned either 10 or 13 days later. If it was 10 days, then Blair would have been in Florida on the day Amy went missing, but if it was 13 days, Blair would have been in San Francisco, and all this speculation about him is moot. I suppose an alternate explanation could be that Blair had no involvement in Amy's disappearance, but he did know her and is still the Hank she was referring to in her diary. If Blair was making advances towards Amy before she went missing, and she vanished while he was out of state, then this might explain his unhealthy obsession with her and his compulsive need to torment her family for the next 2 decades. Even after he was arrested, Blair may not have wanted to admit ever knowing Amy for fear that he would become a suspect. Believe it or not, Blair's wife continued to stand by him during his trial, but that may have changed if he had confessed to being involved with a teenage girl, which is what motivated Blair to stay silent. I don't know. I just have a hard time believing that Blair would have been so driven to keep up a non-stop stream of harassment for 2 decades if Amy was a complete stranger to him. The only thing about this case which seems certain is that Amy was likely abducted by someone who picked her up hitchhiking. It could have been Henry Johnson Blair, it could have been Paul Branch, or it could have been another biker gang, but it also could have been an unknown third party we don't even know about. If Amy was abducted by bikers and was passed around for a period of time after she went missing, I doubt she survived for more than a few years, as she either would have outlived her usefulness or become a liability before whoever had her disposed of her. At one point, during her search for Amy, Sue did cross paths with an attorney who told her he had received information that Amy was in New Jersey, which is where Pompano Red claimed the biker he sold her to was heading. This information was never corroborated, but if it is true, who knows how much longer Amy would have lived under those circumstances. Truthfully, I often lean towards the perpetrator being someone who never showed up on the radar, and that all this business with Blair, Branch, and the bikers is nothing more than smoke and mirrors. If that's the case, then it's a major tragedy that Susan Billig had to spend the last 3 decades of her life chasing false leads. So much time has passed that we may never know the full truth about what actually happened to Amy, but if you happen to have any information on her disappearance, please contact the appropriate authorities. However, if you have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released a spooky Halloween-themed episode about the Ghost Blimp, the baffling story of 2 Navy pilots who vanished without a trace from a blimp while it was in mid-flight during World War II. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Andy W., Lila G., Evelyn H., Dora, Desiree, Joe E., and Tiffany P. Thank you all so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.